Well, I'm back again for another episode of the podcast. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you are having an awesome day and you're loving what you're doing wherever you are, if you're out walking or, on the treadmill or whatever it is that you're doing. I just am so glad that you're here with me. Listen, today I wanted to talk to you about a clinical topic. I recently recorded or taught a webinar on PCOS. And for those of you that were on the webinar, thank you so much. It was hosted by Whole Food Practice. And I went into a deep, deep dive on PCOS, and the feedback has been remarkable. You guys loved it. It was pretty eye-opening, and it was for me as well when I was doing the research. And so I thought for those of you that weren't able to join me on that webinar, that I thought I would share a little part of the webinar that you might find quite fascinating. So this one is a clinical topic, which I don't do too much of, but I thought this was relevant and that you all might enjoy this. So regardless of what supplement company you use or, your approach to practice, many practices deal with women's health issues and hormone-related issues. And as you probably know, PCOS is a pretty significant player when it comes to female reproductive disorders, but also really is a significant player when we're talking about infertility. And so as I was looking, through the research and spending time creating this brand new webinar, I found that they have been looking at for some time, and I just missed it, but using AMH. Now, AMH as a marker, we use that marker in pregnancy, right? It's a marker of ovarian reserve, and it's called anti-Müllerian hormone. Müllerian is Mullerian. So AMH is kind of I called it a new novel player, but it was new to me because I just missed it when I was looking at the research the last time I did this. And what is great about AMH as it has to do, or comparing it to, I guess, other hormones, is that AMH is pretty stable in the bloodstream throughout the month. It just gives an indication of how much of this hormone is present in the follicular tissue so that we know how much viability, the amount of viable eggs or the viability of those follicles are as it has to do with pregnancy. Now, there are some outside influencing factors that can affect AMH levels, notwithstanding the fact that there's possibly poor follicular development. But we do know that obesity can reduce AMH. We know that being on contraceptives, obviously, would reduce AMH. And even there's research showing vitamin D deficiency can play a role in altering AMH levels. But here's where it plays into PCOS. So with PCOS, we know that the granulosa cells inside the follicle are the ones that are producing the estrogen. So they produce the estrogen as that follicle is growing. And in a woman's body, every month, about right before the first day of her menstrual cycle, the actual bleed, her body is choosing anywhere from 6 to 12 ovarian follicles to be, of those 6 to 12 that seem to be the healthiest, the strongest, the most viable at that point in time. The body chooses those 6 to 12 and begins to kind of nurture them, right? Grow them, kind of, groom them with some nice hormones and see if they can grow them up into an adult egg. And one of those eggs or follicles will end up being what we call the Graafian follicle. Now, the Graafian follicle, as it's developing, it's producing more and more and more estrogen. Also, the pooling of estrogen happens because of conversion of androgens, which is also disrupted in PCOS, and that's another subject. But what the researchers have found is in women with PCOS, the levels of AMH are 2 to 3 times higher than those women who do not have polycystic ovaries. And that is because they're suspecting, it's likely because the increased follicular mass, because remember with PCOS, we just have a bunch of partially developed follicles that never reached maturation, but yet their mass is still inside the ovary. And so this higher levels of AMH can be an indicator that there could be PCOS, i.e., there's too many follicles in there that are creating this AMH, and that could be an indicator that there could be PCOS. And they also found that in the follicle, when they looked at the follicular fluid levels, that AMH was significantly elevated. So this isn't just a theory. They've actually found that it's true inside the follicle that there is more AMH. So let me tell you a little bit about how it works. I had a great image in the webinar. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to share that with you here, but I'm going to do my best to describe it. So hang with me here. So during the follicular phase of the cycle, as I mentioned, those early little follicles are being chosen. Those are called primordial follicles. So think of them as little infants. They're little they're little wannabes, right? So these primordial follicles, they produce AMH. That's what they do, okay? That's what they do. When they're growing and growing, they go from a primordial follicle into what's called a primary follicle, and then they go into a secondary follicle. And as you would imagine that as they go and they go through these developmental phases of the growth, that the follicle gets larger and larger and larger. So then subsequently, the levels of AMH produced are more and more and more. So we get rising levels of AMH. That AMH triggers the release of FSH. And so FSH is now on board. As those follicles are growing, the AMH tells the FSH, oh, hey, listen, we got a good follicle here that we think is possibly going to be a great Graafian follicle. The one maybe baby that we're going to promote to be queen of the month. And that follicle has the potential, if fertilized, to become the next maybe baby. So now the FSH begins to turn it on and it starts to produce more estrogen, and we've got androgens, and the aromatase pathway gets activated. And now a woman's body basically takes every single possible resource that it has at its disposal, everything it possibly has, and it converts it into estrogen. That's its job. That's what it does. It's going to convert and convert. We need as much estrogen as we can during that follicular phase in order to get a nice big E2 surge just before ovulation. And that E2 surge is what triggers the pituitary to release LH. LH signals for ovulation. And then we have the creation of the corpus luteum. And that corpus luteum does the hormone production through the second half of the cycle. So where we see the problem with PCOS, though, is in the first half of the cycle, right? It's these follicles that never, ever get all the way developed. They stop. Their development is arrested. Well, what happens when we have that increased AMH? When we get too high levels of AMH, that actually prevents the follicles from maturing because it will block FSH. It doesn't allow FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, to do its job. So then those primordial, primary, secondary follicles, right? It's going through its growth phase. In the early parts of the follicular phase, once it hits that point and we have high follicular levels of AMH and we have high serum levels of AMH, FSH is blocked because it says, hey, we got enough. Why do we need any more? Let's stop this process. Something is not right. With no FSH, we now cannot continue the follicular development of that Graafian follicle. And subsequently, then the development of the follicle is arrested. So the partially developed follicles just kind of hang out in the ovary. And now we've got a problem because what are they producing? More what? AMH. And so now AMH levels just keep going higher and higher and higher. There's no FSH. Aromatase enzyme is stopped. So we're not converting any androgens into estrogen. So now we have two problems. Well, we have multiple problems with PCOS patients, but we have two problems just in this conversation. And that is, number one, those undeveloped follicles are increasing AMH, right? Just by their mere presence and not being fully developed, their development is arrested. But the second problem is without FSH, women are unable to clear those androgens, testosterone and DHT, convert them downstream into estrogen would be the case in a normal cycle. And when that can't happen, then what happens to those androgens? They just keep going up and up and up because the body can't convert them downstream because aromatase enzyme is broken because there's no FSH, and aromatase enzyme is under the control of FSH. So when that feedback loop stops, the FSH goes, hey, whoa, there is way too much AMH going on here. There's something up in the ovaries with these follicles. There is way too much, so we are not going to do anything. FSH stops. Aromatase conversion of androgens into estrogen stops. The androgens start to build up. The follicles are arrested. They continue to produce more AMH. And now we have a big problem because now her body is moving through the follicular phase. It's moving toward the luteal phase. As it moves into the luteal phase, there are certain cells inside that follicle. They're called theca cells, Theca. Those theca cells continue to produce progesterone, but the progesterone converts down into androgens and it can't get to estrogen. So we have kind of two ways that we're starting to accumulate these androgens. And so women end up with this high levels of androgens, and we end up with high levels of AMH and arrested follicular development. So what would the first place we want to think about this, if a woman has follicles that are in the ovaries, and usually they'll discover this via ultrasound, but when she has these follicles in her ovaries, what we want to do is we want to use white peony and licorice. White peony and licorice, those two together, and they're in several different products from different companies, etc. I can only tell you what I've done. And what I've done is I've used the liquids from MediHerb that you can purchase through standard process. I've used these for 20 years. And this white peony and licorice combination, there is lots of clinical research behind these two herbs. In fact, they use them in Chinese medicine. But those two together will reduce those follicular cysts. It works just every time. It's such a great combination. It's 60 mils of white peony and 40 mils of licorice. And those two together, and you dose that at about 15 mils a day. That's how I've done it. Divided, and you want to dilute that before you do it. It tastes bad. I'm just going to warn you. The white peony tastes bad. The licorice is fairly sweet, but the white peony, whoo, saucy. It's really bad. Anyway, you want to give that white peony and licorice, and then what that does is that starts to reduce those cysts. It actually starts to break them down, reduces the cyst. So what's going to happen then? We're going to have lower levels of AMH. And as we get lower levels of AMH, what follicular phase hormone is going to turn back on? FSH, right? That's going to come back online. And when FSH comes back online, what enzyme does FSH control? Yes, FSH controls the aromatase enzyme. So now the aromatase enzyme is going to wake back up, and it's going to start converting those androgens down to estrogen, which is what we need in the cycle. We don't want her without any estrogen because the estrogen is what creates that good, healthy follicle. Now, insulin resistance, diet, obesity, oh, there's all kinds of other things going on here. But I thought this was so fascinating to me, how having these follicular cysts is such like a domino effect, right? One thing happens and it goes wrong, and then the whole domino chain starts to go downstream, and pretty soon we have high levels of androgens, high levels of AMH, no FSH, no aromatase enzyme, and it's just a recipe for disaster. So no wonder she's infertile. She couldn't get an egg out of that ovary to save her life. So what we want to do is start to reduce those cysts, which is going to reduce that AMH, turn FSH and aromatase back on, and get some of those androgens cleared out. She's going to feel better. You're probably going to want to do some adrenal support in there. You're definitely going to want to do some diet support, get weight down. Obesity is a contributing factor. So there's a lot of other things that you can do. I've got more on this inside Clinical Academy as a full standalone lesson. So you can go to rondanelson.com/clinical academy to join there. Got a full training on that. But if you'd like this type of information, just get on my list, rondanelson.com/join. And I would love to have you on the list. You'll get notifications about what's happening and where I'm going. And on that note, as I wrap it up, on that note, I'm going to be teaching my very first live seminar. First one in, let me think, 4, 5, 6 years. 6 years I've just been online. So for those of you that were seminar junkies back in the day, I would love to have you join me. I'm going to be in Des Moines, Iowa on September the 14th and 15th 2024. The link to register is in the show notes, but you will start hearing a little bit more about this as we go. I'm flying in, and I would love nothing more than to see your sweet faces and have you join me in Des Moines for this seminar. We're going to be talking about how to combine business and clinical. So we're going to get some clinical training, we're going to get some business training, kind of an all-in-one deal. So again, the link to register, and it's open to anyone. You can register. We'll put the link in the show notes. So I hope this was helpful for you, this little sidebar conversation about PCOS. I just had so much good feedback. Everybody was loving it. And so I thought for those of you that weren't able to come, I would just share a little bit of that nugget with you. So have a wonderful week. I hope this PCOS information is helpful for you. Take care. I'll see you next week on the podcast.